My name's Kathy Harms. I want to thank you for coming. I worked with Bob for many, many years, like many in this room did. And I think we have a lovely evening planned. I would like to compliment Bob's longtime friend Mary Boyd, Karen Gordon, Laura McCarthy, David James, and Wayne Heimer for putting most of this together. And I hope you learned something about our friend Bob. He was a one in a million. I think when I hear the term Renaissance man, I think of Bob. There were very few things he wasn't interested in or couldn't do. I would venture a guess that every person in this room that knew Bob knew a different guy. And the range of his interests was significant. I mean, I've never met anyone who knew science, wildlife management, art, anthropology, archaeology, physiology, alternate medicine, and motorcycles. He's an amazing guy. Our first speaker tonight is Wayne Heimer, who shared an office with him for decades and was probably a longtime best friend.
What I have for you will pass for the reading of a eulogy. That happens sometimes at this sort of event. A year and a day ago, Bob Stephenson died peacefully in his beloved Goldstream Valley cabin at age 71. Bob is survived by one sister and a niece. We used to think that 71 was a ripe old age. Now, however, we think Bob died too soon. His death was hastened by a long struggle with alcohol addiction. That struggle was a real trial for all of us, but we're not here to dwell on that. We're here to remember the real Bob that was Bob when he was Bob. Bob loved living simply, and his passion for keeping antique machinery, particularly Volvos, running far past their expiration dates is well known. Back when Steve Cooper had been just elected governor, Mary recalls that Bob gave the new Governor Cooper and his wife a ride from the airport to the Fairbanks inaugural ball. To mitigate the perpetual backseat blizzard of dog hair in wild red, Bob and Mary draped the seats with clean sheets. And we all know the little bob hair, little dog hair, or little bob hair wouldn't bother Bob very much. But Bob went to extreme lengths to accommodate guests. One of my memories of Bob going to extreme lengths was we were freighting a prefab cabin out to the mountains for winter use, and it fell off the helicopter on the way. I was in the mountains, the shed was down in the forest somewhere. Bob went back to the Midway Lodge and brought me a Midway burger. That's how he was. Bob grew up in Wisconsin, where an uncle kindled his love for the outdoors and pipe tobacco. Bob came to Fairbanks for graduate school in 1967, arriving about the time of the Great Fairbanks Flood. He began living simply, renting Pacetti's small log cabin off Dolly Varden Lane. Bob studied Aleutian foxes for his master's degree at UAF. This probably accounts for some pictures you'll see a little later on of Bob with marine mammals. After graduating, Bob was hired as a wolf biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. That was 1970. During his graduate school and early fish and game years, Bob served as a medic in the Alaska National Guard. Being a humble guy, Bob realized he didn't know enough about wolves to be a credible wolf biologist and prevailed on his supervisor, who was then John Burns Sr., to learn about wolves from people who knew them well, the Eskimos of Anaktuvuk Pass. Burns agreed. The unprecedented result of this cooperation was possibly the first integration of traditional ecological knowledge into modern wildlife management. Whether you approve of wolf management to benefit humans or not, most will agree that the romantic mysticism regarding wolves as wilderness symbols needed a dose of practical reality when Bob came on the scene. If Alaskan wildlife management were ever to have any possibility of providing food security for Alaskans, living off the land, database knowledge was necessary, and Bob provided it. Along the way, Bob was a great help to others studying wolves and served on the UN's International Wolf Conservation Committee. Bob had several adventures in wolf biology in Unit 13 as well as in the interior. Initially, he was sent there to see why moose weren't thriving. Among those that Bob cooperated with in Unit 13 was a young fellow named Vic Van Ballenberg. Bob helped Vic spend some of his pipeline research money intended to document moose crossing the pipeline route coloring wolves. Bob called it commando biology. When the director of the day found out, he fired Vic. Bob went to the newly minted ombudsman of that day and got Vic a hearing, which resulted in his appointment to the Fairbanks office as the fur bearer biologist. The rest is history. As a result of his forays in Unit 13, Bob advised that bears were likely a major mortality factor for moose there. This visionary suggestion was not what ADF&G anticipated and wanted to hear, and took years to demonstrate it, but it proved to be correct. Bob's next job was to keep Alaska lynx off the U.S. endangered species list because they look kind of like threatened Canadian lynx. Working with the complex personalities involved in lynx trapping showcased one of Bob's unique gifts. He could get along with almost anyone. After the ultralight incident, Bob's work was instrumental in keeping lynx trapping viable in Alaska. I might point out that some of Bob's personality and talent choices turned out a little better than others. Good to have Craig here. Bob's most recent and presently best known adventure was the reintroduction of wood bison to Alaska. That was a 20-year odyssey of red tape and bureaucratic warfare. Having had lynx-based experience with the morass of endangered species regulations, having a high appreciation for irony, and being an original thinker, Bob was equipped to deal patiently with the maddening bureaucratic and political hassles attending this project. And last year, more than 100 wood bison were reintroduced to Alaska. Of course, Bob had more than a little help on that project, as well as all the other things that he did that aren't just Bob. He was just there and a leader. Among the things you might not know about Bob were that he was a certified scuba diver. He was a watercolor artist of more than passable talent. He built and flew, briefly, an ultralight aircraft, had broad interests in reading and writing beyond the technical world, and was respected by many of the preeminent wildlife scientists of his time. Bob was a kind and gentle man who loved people. He advised many folks with medical problems, and some of us are much better off as a result. In fact, Alaska is better off because Bob came here almost 50 years ago. If you want to know more about Bob Stephenson, he's featured in a chapter of Alaska's Greatest Outdoor Legends, recently published by the University of Alaska Press.
Thanks, Wayne. Like I said, I think in addition to each of us knowing a different Bob, each of us may learn something about Bob tonight. Thank you for that. Next speaker is David James, who is the past regional supervisor of Wildlife Division of Fish and Game and served as Bob's supervisor for the last portion of his career.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here to help celebrate Bob's life. He was really a remarkable individual, very complex, very multidimensional. If I were given free rein and started to freelance from right here extemporaneously, you wouldn't be home before midnight. So I have restricted myself to 2 terse pages that I hope at least cover some of the salient points I'd like to make about Bob. By the way, I guess I was already introduced. I don't have to do that. Thank you, Kathy. In my opinion, Bob was unconventional, somewhat eccentric, free-spirited, and fiercely independent. And those descriptors barely scratched the surface. I came to the conclusion that if one of Bob's missions on Earth was to make sure his friends and colleagues were never bored, he was an unqualified success. I met Bob in 1976, at which time he hired me as a temporary technician for a wolf research project that turned out to be my graduate project. At that time, it was inconceivable to me that someday I would join the ranks of those who supervised Bob during his career at Fish and Game. During those supervisory years, I not infrequently encouraged other colleagues at Fish and Game, for gosh sakes, think outside the box, while simultaneously dreaming up schemes to put Bob back in the box. I was, as were Bob's previous supervisors, remarkably unsuccessful in that ill-advised endeavor. I often wondered if we had prevailed, Would Bob have spent time in participant observation with the Indian hunters in Unutuvik learning about wolves? Would he have used an ultralight to study the habits of lynx? Would he have had the audacity to single-handedly initiate a program to bring wood bison back to Alaska? I don't think so. Humor was one of Bob's trademarks. The unique quality of Bob's style of humor often was a facade of innocent goofiness that those who did not know him could well easily be fooled and miss the underlying sharp wit and intellectual curiosity that are also his trademarks. Bob's office at work was something to behold. Papers, reports, books, skulls, posters, field equipment, and much, much more spilled from his desk and bookshelves onto the floor. Literally, it was difficult to find a place to stand, much less sit, in his office. The appearance of his office suggested disorganization and chaos. But don't be fooled. I'm not exaggerating when I say that you could ask him for some obscure report or scientific paper, and he would reach into, around, or behind one of those stacks, and invariably he could pull it out. I saw him do this for publications dating as far back as the 1970s. I often marveled at what kind of a brain an individual must possess in order to mentally create order out of so much disarray. It's beyond my comprehension. Bob was incredibly generous and kind-hearted. We'll never know how much of his time and money he gave away to family, friends, colleagues, and even strangers in time of need. He possessed an unusual capacity for empathy for those who suffered. And of course, he was a vocal advocate for alternative medicine. Many years ago, I was severely ill for a period of time. Bob was the only one that maintained constant contact, offering his encouragement and various miracle medical cures that I absolutely had to try. His concern was touching, and I've never forgotten it. No celebration of Bob's life would be complete without acknowledging his role in the reintroduction of wood bison to Alaska. I think it was the seminal accomplishment of his career. The project started out fairly straightforward. He started working on it in the early 1990s, but almost immediately it encountered unexpected snags. When I joined him in his crusade in 1996, it was to drag on for another 19 years. The legal, political, and bureaucratic obstacle course that had to be overcome defies my ability to succinctly summarize it in my brief words this evening. It was truly horrible. The frustrations and disappointments, an unbelievable volume of good old-fashioned blood, sweat, and tears, quite frankly, wore Bob out. He gave 100% of himself and then some. It was to a cause he believed in, and he paid the price with no regrets. The eventual success of the wood bison reintroduction depended on the contribution of others, of course. It took many individuals from Fish and Game, other state agencies, universities, federal agencies, volunteers, nonprofits, the private sector, financial donors, and on, up through, including the governor of the state of Alaska. But when all was said and done, it was Bob's idea and determined effort to see it become a reality that set the path for the rest of us to follow. It was hardly a secret that Bob was bitterly disappointed that the first bison release in 2015 was not destined for the Yukon Flats. At least for a time, he even viewed it as a failure. This view stemmed, I believe, very strongly from his seriously deteriorating health. It is my fervent hope that in the last few months of his life, he viewed the release into the Innoko River as the first step on a journey that many of us believe will inevitably lead wood bison right back to the Yukon Flats. Restoration of wood bison to their historic range in Alaska, I believe, will stand as one of the great wildlife conservation accomplishments in the history of modern wildlife management. We can thank Bob Stephenson for that legacy. Thank you.
Our next speaker was a good friend of Bob's who came up and spent time with him doing research for an amazing book, the renowned author Barry Lopez.
I feel like the outlander here, coming up from Oregon, and I want to give you a little bit of background about my relationship with Bob, who's gone now, of course. I've come up here with a heavier heart maybe than some of you have. My wife and I have lost 14 friends in the past 18 months, 8 of them to cancer. So what Wayne said about 71 used to be, you know, now a lot of us are not making it much further because for natural reasons, of course, but also because, especially in the case of cancer, we've built a world that makes it a more widespread disease. In the fall of 1975, I wrote Bob Stephenson a letter and asked if I could come to Alaska and talk to him. And the reason for that was that I wanted to write a book about wolves, and in the same way that he was idiosyncratic in doing things his way, I was idiosyncratic in doing them my way. And I had read a book of scientific papers edited by a guy named Michael Fox called Wild Canids, I think. And every paper, as carefully as it was written, was predictable until you got to this paper written by Bob Stephenson and Bob Agok. And then the world opened up for me and wolves and what I wanted to try to make come alive on a page. So I wrote Bob and said, I'd like to come up and talk to you. And I had no idea whether he would say, get lost, or not for you, pal, or whatever it was, you know. But he said, come on up. So I came, I will never forget it because it was my first trip to Alaska, the 17th of March, 1976, St. Patrick's Day. And we met at the airport and shook hands and went out and got some groceries and went to his cabin, and 3 days later we were in Nelchina Basin south of the Alaska Range radio collaring wolves. That was a pretty quick transition from just meeting, but he was so welcoming and we had great rapport and appreciated each other's take on the world. I knew when I walked into his cabin that first night and saw all of the scientific literature and also a lot of books that most scientists will never read. I'll also remember I bunked out in the corner of the cabin where the dog food was, quite a few dogs. And it was a big bag of Imes dog food. And I put my head in the pillow and I just looked down like that thinking, Imes, I don't think I've ever seen that kind of dog food. And then I turned my head a little bit more and it said directions. And I read, pour in a bowl, add water, stand back. So I knew this was going to be another dimension of my kind of guy. So over the years we did a lot of things together. We were on the Upper Yukon and Charlie River for a while together, and out on St. Lawrence Island and at Aniktuvik, and we camped for a while on the Uticok River when ADF&G had a camp over there in the Western Brooks Range. So we saw a lot of country together and a lot of animals. And when 25 years after Of Wolves and Men came out, and the publisher decided to do a 25th anniversary edition of the book, and so I called Bob and we were on the phone for about 3 hours, mostly talking about how when nobody knew who we were, we got away with so much. We would just requisition some things and disappear, and we would have some kind of marching orders, you know, from John Burns, or somebody would cover for us, and off we went. Not in Volvos always, or on motorcycles. We usually commercialed in somewhere, or chartered in somewhere and then took off. But those were formative years for me as a writer. I couldn't sink my teeth into what I wanted to do as a writer until I came to Alaska and until I met Bob. And then that led to meeting John Haynes and my very dear friend John Luther Adams and Richard Nelson. And those four men, more than anybody I think of in university, affected the way that I saw the world by helping me understand what I was trying to do as a writer. So I want to go back to this moment, radio-collared wolves in Nelchina Basin. In a way that probably could only happen in Alaska. We had a Jet Ranger with Stokes litters on the side, and a fellow whose name I can't remember, who took that helicopter in the morning and a radio transmitter and went out and found radio-collared wolves and shot them. Landed, loaded them in the Stokes litters, and by the time he got them back to the little camp we had, they were frozen solid. Bob and I did our work in the afternoon, so the first thing we had to do was unload these frozen animals, which was like picking up a 6 by 12, about 5 feet long, and putting it in the back of a pickup. And then we went and did our work, which was to cut tracks on a lake bed or something like that until we found them, and dart them, and do a field exam and put a radio collar on them. And the contrast between two things happening with the same helicopter in the same day taught me a lot about politics and how wolves pay the price for the ruminations of people in Juneau who've never been outdoors. That's a harsh thing to say, but we all know about what it is to live at a desk and not to live at a desk, and that's part of what Bob was all about. And that's a lesson that he gave us, which was step away from the desk if you really want to know what's going on in the world. The first night that we slept together in a little trailer, Bob slept at the back end of it and I slept at the front end of it, I heard him crying. So that was another introduction to how deeply a wildlife biologist cares about what happens to the animals over which he had some sense of responsibility. He didn't see it in public, and he didn't take anything out on the guy who took off every morning with a rifle to kill the animals. We just went out together and tried to explain it to the wolves and radio collared more, and hoped that with enough of a database, something like this wouldn't have to happen again and again and again. On that drive to Nelchina Basin from up here, back and forth, I realized that this was one unusual wildlife biologist. He had all of the empirical information and the Western approach to studying animals down pat, but he had something else that I had never encountered, and that was what was in that article that he and Bob Akok wrote for that collection of papers that Michael Fox put together, which is there's another way of knowing. And on the drive down and back, we covered a lot of questions, and I didn't say this to him at the time, but I had spent about 10 days in the month before, in December of, or 3 months before, in December of '75, with Dave Meach, who at that time was recognized as the owner of the animal, I guess some people would say. The person who had established himself as the one to define the animal, without the animal's permission, of course, but if if it contradicted something that Dave had to say about Canis lupus, then you had to make a case for it. And what I saw in Bob was that nobody can make a case for this animal. It is a mystery, and you can learn something by apprenticing yourself to it, but nobody can claim to know the whole thing. Nobody can say that the wolf is a sucked orange and we move on to something else. So those elements, a man broken down in tears because of what his work required, somebody who just put it back together when in the morning we killed wolves and in the afternoon we radio collared them, and somebody who had more than one way of knowing about wolves made a profound impression on me, and it's affected the way that I've written about virtually everything I've done. At that time, 41 years ago, I'd not traveled the way I have now. I've been to about 80 countries and written for a lot of people about a lot of things. But the foundation for the work that I did, including Arctic Dreams, was set by my encounter with this man. And it's impossible to say what part fit where, but Haynes too, and John Adams and Richard Nelson. The second thing that impressed me about Bob is when I saw his different way of looking at things in action. And this, I think, was in winter of '77, and somebody here at ADF&G had gotten 103 wolf carcasses out of the freezer and was doing methodically necropsies of every one of the animals, which is a very precise, by-the-book kind of thing to see whatever they could find. And the statistic I remember from that was that 52 of the 103 wolves had traumatic injuries. Broken limbs, broken jaws, skull fractures, broken legs. And I thought, oh my God, really? You know, that it was that hard to make a living as a wolf? So I mentioned something to Bob about it, and he said, yeah, most of them were moose hunters. That's what I mean, you know. He understood how to put all of these different pieces together instantly. But he was fundamentally a Western-trained biologist, true to his own culture. I remember one time Bob and I were laughing. We were at a party here, and a couple of people were trying to introduce themselves as one-quarter Eskimo, or, you know, they were looking to play the card that, you know, actually I'm a white person, but actually here's my genome, and, you know, actually I've got credibility because I'm also native. And Bob, in the middle of one of these introductions, stuck his hand into the same person and said, "Hi, Bob Stephenson, 100% white man." So he brought things down to earth in that way. But when we were in Algena Basin, we cut a trail of about 6 wolves in a pack, or maybe there were 7, and they split up. We shot a couple of them, and one of them went down in a bunch of trees, and the helicopter couldn't get very close. So we got out of the helicopter and worked our way through the trees. And as we got out of the helicopter, Bob said, as a female, I was about 8 years old. And I said, come on. Nobody can tell how old a wolf is or sex the animal from a distance like this. And he said, well, you know, that's what they taught me to do anyway. They're non-good people. So we came up to the wolf and I lifted her leg. She was female. I lifted her lip and saw the wear on her teeth, 7 or 8 years old. So he had a way of doing the necropsies and doing all of the note-taking that would make the work he did credible in a scientific journal. But he also had this other part of himself that was aware of a very different way in which those animals could be known. So both of those things were working in my mind when I began Of Fools and Men. And another story that I will tell you quickly about how self-effacing he was. We were in Anaktuvik Pass once, and we would go out from the village. He had a sod house up there, some of you know. We went out from the village and just walked big time in that big open country. And one evening we saw a bird, and it prompted a story from him. And he told me that one time he and another fellow, Bob Aguk, as a matter of fact, were looking for wolf dens. And he said, I was in front of Bob Aguk was behind him, and he said, this bird went by my face like that, and I saw just enough of it to know that it was a robin, and was pretty proud of that, because it was just a split second. So I turned around to Bob and in a very cool way tried to say, hey Bob, you see that robin? And Bob said to him, yeah, wolf den. So Bob was nonplussed by the response, but what Bob Aguk had seen was that the bird flew by, and he extended the line like this, where it was going, where it had come from. He saw there were 4 or 5 guard hairs in the bird's bill for nesting, and that the guard hairs had a yellowish color to them. The only situation in which you would see that color of guard hairs on a wolf would be a lactating female. And so when he extended the line and saw a shelf on a hill a couple of 100 feet away, he knew that's where that female was lying in the sun to get a little bit of a break from the puppies. So Bob would tell that story to say, you try to pay attention and you think you know a lot, but here's somebody this is their whole life. So when they see something, they've seen about 20 more things than you have. But for him to tell that story about himself, I marked that too. We all of us want to be remembered for what we tried to be in our lives, for the shape of our desire and the keenness of it, and not the pettiness of our lives, or for what we did in our lives out of fear. Bob wanted, at his core, I think, for wolves and lynx and wood bison to be better off. And he wanted us, his own culture, to end up better off than what he found when he came here. He pioneered, with very few others outside of his mentors, I think, Bud Fay and John Burns were among them, the idea that traditional indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge was not only informative in wildlife management, but necessary for its health. In the end, Bob became fractious and destabilized. I think David said the right thing, that disease got to him, and the difficulty in the final years of the wood bison work got to him, and some people have troublesome memories from those years of Bob's life. He was undone in part, I think, as David also said, by his perception that some people took advantage of his generosity. The point of this is that at the time of a man's death, the thing is not the failing, which in the wrong hands could be used to describe every one of us in this room, but to answer only this question, and that is, did his life help? And I would say it did. It helped animals become more complexly and profoundly known to us. It helped us to understand more enlightened forms of wildlife management, and it helped those less inclined to speak than we are pass along anyway the natural history of which they were custodians. And finally, and this is the least of it, he helped some young, wet behind the ears man from Oregon who came up to Alaska 41 years ago and said that he wanted to write about wolves, and was smart enough to apprentice himself to somebody who knew something. Thank you.
Next up, we have a beautiful video montage of Bob that was put together through a lot of people's help with finding photos and so forth. But when I was thanking people early on, I didn't mention specifically Scott Brainerd or Darren Bruning from the Fish and Game Office, who really helped put the finishing touches on this. So, Bob and Bob's life.
Come, lonely hunter, chieftain and king, I will fly like the falcon when I go. Bear me, my brother, under your wing, I will strike fell like lightning when I go. I will billow like the thunder drum, invoke the storm of war, twisting billows spawn of dust and blood up from the prairie floor. I will sweep the foe before me like a gale out on the snow, and the wind will all recount the story, reverence and glory when I go.
I will leap like coyote when I go. Tireless entrancer, lend me your skin. I will run like the gray wolf when I go. I will climb the rise at daybreak. I will kiss the sky at noon. Raise my yearning voice at midnight to my mother in the moon. I will make the defeat and draw the chorus slow. Send this message down the wire and hope that someone wise is listening when I go.
Sun comes trumpets from his red house in the east. He will find the standing stone where long I chanted my release. He will send his morning messenger to strike the hammer below, and I will crumble down uncountable in showers of crimson rubies when I go.
Sister, whisper and turn. I will rattle like dry leaves when I go.
Stand in the mist where my fire used to burn. I will camp on the night breeze when I go. And should you glimpse my wandering form out on the borderline between death and resurrection and the council of the pines, do not worry for my comfort, do not sorrow for me so. All your diamond tears will rise up and adorn the sky beside me when I go. Do not worry for my comfort,
do not sorrow for me so. All your diamond tears will rise up and adorn the sky beside me when I go.
These are the days of the endless summer. These are the days, the time is now. There is no past, there's only future. There's only here, there's only now. Oh, your smiling face, your gracious presence, the fires of spring are kindling bright. Are the radiant heart, you're the song of glory, the cry of freedom in the night. These are the days by the sparkling river, His timely grace and our treasured faith. This is the love of the one magician. Turn the water into wine. All right. Days of the endless dancing, yeah, the long walks on the summer night. These are the days of the true romancing, when I'm holding you, oh so tight. These are the days of a sparkling river, grace in the treasure to find. This is the love of the one great magician. Turn the water into wine. These are the days now that we must savor and we must enjoy as we can. These are the days that will last forever. You got to hold them in your heart. Na 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 na.
Pretty amazing life, all in all. Now another musical interlude from Michael.
It's life.